Today I want to address a question that I get asked by quite a few students, and that is, what size saw blade should I choose for my project? The simple answer is it depends on the thickness of your metal. And what I want to do today is just kind of give you an idea of the relationship between your metal thickness and the size of the blade, so you have a good understanding of why one blade might work differently than another. I like to use an analogy that involves sawing wood because a lot of us have seen that or done that. If you have a 2x4 and you want to saw through it by hand, you would probably grab one of those big floppy saws, the ones with the wood handle and the tapered metal blade with really big teeth. And if you cut through that, it would just kind of grab on nicely, start zipping through, and it would take a few minutes, but you would get through your saw blade with a pretty good rhythm and effective cutting. If you use that same coarse, big, floppy saw for a dowel rod, if you can imagine, the dowel rod would it would be too small for that tool, right? You've got these big teeth and this little dowel rod, and the teeth would just kind of jump and jag and never really get a grip on the dowel rod, and you would have a hard time holding that dowel rod still. And I don't think that that big saw blade would really be very effective at cutting the dowel rod. So it is an inappropriate tool for such a small piece of wood. Instead, you might want to use a hacksaw, and a hacksaw has a smaller blade with finer teeth, and if you can imagine using a hacksaw to go through a dowel rod, you can picture how it would get a good grip. It would start cutting and zip, 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 you would just go right through your dowel rod. So that size blade is appropriate for a dowel rod. Then let's go back to the 2x4. If you were going to use that finer blade on the 2x4, well, you would just end up sawing forever because it just would never really quite make it through. It just is ineffective. The teeth are just too small for such a big piece of wood. Plus, you would probably dull your blade at least a quarter to a third of the way in, if not sooner. So that blade would be too fine for the thicker piece of wood. With the jewelry tool, with this jeweler's saw blade and saws, it is pretty much the same thing. It's just a little bit more nuanced because all the tools are so much finer. But if you have a thick piece of metal and you grab a saw blade that's too thin, you're just going to be feeling like you're not getting through that metal at all. And you will dull your saw blade really fast. It just will feel very ineffective, like it's just not cutting anything. And then conversely, if you use a coarse saw blade on a very thin piece of metal, it's going to like catch and jump, and you won't be able to get a good flow because it's never going to get gain purchase. It's never going to get that good grip that you need to start so that you have a good smooth flowing rhythm to your sawing. So you would have to go with a thinner one. So you see, it's kind of the same concept. It's just, like I said, a little bit more nuanced with these smaller blades. The official rule is you want 3 teeth, so 3 teeth on the blade per thickness of the metal. And we're not going to grab a magnifying glass or a microscope or anything to try to look at how many teeth are in these tiny little blades. We're just not going to do it. So people make charts. And here is my chart. In a minute, I'm going to put this on the screen and I will go through how to read that chart. And I'll also put a link in the comments or the description of the video so that you have a place where you can go online and print this out. Okay, so let's look at our chart here. On the left-hand side, the very first column, that's our thickness of metal. So 26 gauges at the top, that's the thinner metal in this case, and down at the bottom is 18 gauge, that's thicker metal. Across the top row, Those are our saw blade sizes. And it's really important to understand how saw blades are sized because you want to make sure when you're buying it you don't accidentally get the wrong one. So let's look at the number 0 for instance. If we go to the right on this particular chart, it goes number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Those are getting bigger. But if you go to the left of the 0, you have 1/0, 2/0, 3/0, 4/0. Those are getting finer. So when you purchase these, if you grab if you want a size 2/0 blade, you could accidentally buy a size 2 blade if you're not careful. So the 0 sizes will always have that slash mark and the little 0 or circle after it. The number sizes are either just the number with no slash or anything, or they'll have the hashtag number sign in front of it. So on this particular chart, the finest blade is 8/0 on the far left, and the coarsest blade is number 4 on the far right. One last thing about that chart is that you may have noticed that that there are 5 gray boxes for every row of metal thickness. And what that means is that there are 5 saw blade sizes that are appropriate for each thickness of metal. The reason for that is that the differences between each saw blade size are very subtle, and so that offers us a range of choices that we can use for every size. There are essentially 3 things that are going to help you decide what size saw blade you're going to use for your project. The first one is what we just went over. What is the most appropriate size for the thickness of metal that I'm working with? And you will refer to a chart and you're going to have 4 or 5 options for that thickness of metal. And you're best off choosing one of those options. Another thing, a second thing that might inform your decision is what size saw blades do you have on hand? So for instance, if I want to cut 24 gauge and according to my chart, the largest size blade I should use is 3/0. Well, what if I go looking and all I have is 2/0? I'm still going to use the 2/0. I'm not going to hold up my project just so I can get something else in stock, because that 2/0 is pretty close to the 5 suggested options that the chart lays out. The one thing that's important is if you go outside the realm of those 5 suggested saw blade sizes, it might feel a little different. So if I'm using that 2/0 blade to cut through my 24 gauge metal, I might feel it just a little bit jerkier and jaggier. And that goes back to that analogy I was talking about with the wood sawing. It's going to feel a little bit different as you change saw blade sizes. The third thing that might inform your decision about what size saw blade you're going to use is what size line you want. How fine do you want your cutting to be? So if you go on the thicker side or the coarser side of the suggested appropriate saw blade sizes, you're going to create a thicker, coarser line. And then, of course, the finer you go, the finer your line will be. So if you're just cutting a straight line and you just want to just get through there, you could go with a coarser one of those 5 options, and it'll just cut right through. But if you have delicate, fine saw work that you're trying to, a pattern or a design that you're trying to cut through, you might want to choose on the finer end of those suggested saw blade sizes. One thing that I like to do, or I like to suggest, is go ahead and try a few different size saw blades with a particular sheet of metal, especially if you use that size sheet quite often. So for instance, I use a lot of 24 and 22 gauge sheet, and I tend to use 4/0 for both of those. If I have to do real fine, delicate work, I might go a little bit finer, especially for the 24 gauge. But I find myself to be really comfortable with 4/0 and 5/0 blades. So if you were to practice with a couple of different blades that are within that range for a particular metal, then you will get a feel for how each blade has a different nuanced effect and how it feels different, and you'll end up choosing the one that is the way you like the way it feels. But you might make a different choice depending on the project that you're working on. So I hope that helped clear up some of the questions you might have. It's not a real complicated thing, but I really do think that it's important to understand why or how each saw blade reacts differently in the metal and how it feels and what result you're going to get, because then you make the best informed decision for your project. It's not just a matter of grabbing something off the bench and you don't know what size it is, but it works. You know what I mean? You want to have a little more control over it than that. And understanding the relationship between the thickness of the metal and the size of the saw blade will help inform you with those decisions. So happy sawing, and I'll see you next time.